Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming in. Part of our continuing series where we talk to professors on the left, professors on the right, academics, activists, politicians, reporters, anybody who can talk intelligently about where we are in America and the topic of political polarization. We want to provide those interviews and their perspective, unedited and unaltered, directly to you, the public, so that you could do this thing that was popular when I was in high school called thinking for yourself. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. With us today, it is our privilege to have Professor George C. Edwards III. He's the Distinguished Professor Emeritus, Political Science at Texas A&M University at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Very pleased to have him with us today. George C. Edwards III is a university distinguished professor of political science and Jordan Chair in Presidential Studies Emeritus at Texas A&M University. He has served as both the Winnett Professor of American Government and the Olin Professor of American Government at the University of Oxford, the John Adams Fellow at the University of London, senior visiting positions at the Sciences Po Paris, Peking University, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He's an associate member of Newfield College, Oxford, and was the founder, and from 1991 to 2001, the director of the Center for Presidential Studies. Edwards has written or edited 27 books on American politics and public policymaking, and is the editor of Presidential Studies Quarterly and general editor of the Oxford Handbook of American Politics. That's very prestigious. Among his recent books, Prisoners of Their Premises, Changing Their Minds, analyzes the inability of President Trump to overcome the usual constraints on presidential leadership, Predicting the Presidency. Princeton University Press shows how understanding the nature of presidential leadership allows us to predict the legislative success of a president, and investigates the president's leadership of those predisposed to support his initiatives. Overreach analyzes presidential leadership during the Obama presidency, The Strategic President, On Deaf Ears, and Why the Electoral College is Bad for America, or some of the other books. Give me a second. We're going to go to the next page. He has served as the Presidency Research Section of the American Political Science Association, which has named its annual dissertation prize in his honor and awarded him its Career Service Award. A member of the Phi Beta Kappa and Woodrow Wilson Fellow, he has received the Decoration for Distinguished Civilian Service from the U.S. military, the Pi Sigma Alpha Prize from the Southern Political Science Association. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, very prestigious. He has spoken to more than 300 universities and other groups in the U.S. and abroad, keynoted numerous national and international conferences, and done several thousand interviews with national and international press. He also applies his scholarship to practical issues of governing, including advising Brazil on its constitution and the operation of its presidency, Russia on building a democratic national party system, Mexico on elections, and Chinese scholars on democracy. So very well researched on U.S. presidents and democracy around the world, and has taught at many universities, both here in America and abroad. These are some of the universities. He's been at Texas A&M, Oxford, and Tulane University. Many different visiting positions, Winnett Professor, University of Oxford, Newfield College, Chair in VT Sciences Po Paris, etc. Let me see if I can get the next page up. And we already covered some of his books. There they are again. A lot on presidencies, and presidents going back decades. And this is the article where I found him. But before we get into that, Professor, how did I do? Is there anything I said incorrectly? Is there something we need to correct on your bio that I need to correct right now, Professor?
No, I think you got it right.
Okay. Excellent. I always love to hear that. So this is the article where I found you. Washington Post, American democracy is cracking. These forces help explain why. Behind the sense that the political system is broken lies a collision between forces both old and new. It came out in 2023 in August. Give me 1 second to transfer the page. We'll get to those. And here's the section. When we get to the election of presidents, the Constitution created an unusual mechanism for electing president and electoral college. It was built on assumptions that over the years have proven to be faulty. The founders distrusted a system based on the popular vote. Fearing Mideast citizens would not be well informed, they put power in the hands of electors. They thought the House would often end up picking the president, not anticipating the effects of what quickly became a two-party system in the United States. The rationale for the current system has been overrun by the realities of today's politics. Quote, "It was created because the founders couldn't figure out what to do," said George C. Edwards III, political science professor. Why the Electoral College is bad for America. So let's start there. Is the Electoral College bad for America? Is it working the way the founders designed? And if it's not, is that a cause of political polarization in America?
Well, there's several questions here.
I apologize.
First of all, that's perfectly okay. I just will take them in order, okay? First, the Electoral College doesn't work at all like the founders expected it to. They expected the electors to exercise complete discretion, and so they expected no one to be receiving a majority of the votes, and thus it would be thrown into the House of Representatives, where some other elites would actually choose the president. And that's what they expected to happen. It doesn't operate that way at all. As we know, electors generally do not exercise discretion. I mean, there's occasionally a rogue elector who, when it doesn't really matter in terms of the election of the president, exercise discretion. But generally, they do not. And, of course, the House hasn't selected the president since 1824. So that's, 200 years. So it doesn't, we can't say, well, the founders were really brilliant. They knew what they were doing. They created this system, and we really need to stick with it, because that doesn't make any sense. The electors did not know what they were doing. They had no idea. They had no precedent for popularly elected or democratically elected, small d, elected chief executive. And they couldn't decide. They couldn't agree among themselves. Some wanted direct election of the president. Others were a bit nervous about it. There were other interests to protect, slavery being one of them. At any rate, the bottom line is that they cobbled this Electoral College together at the end of the Constitutional Convention and basically kicked the can down the road, expecting that future generations would figure out the way to elect the president. At any rate, okay, so the consequence of this is, first of all, that sometimes, and twice in this century, the person who becomes president is not the person who gets the most votes. It's the person who comes in second, which is somewhat ironic in a democracy, because why do you hold an election if you don't care who gets the most votes? At any rate, that violates fundamental core values of democracy, meaning political equality. So every person's vote doesn't count equally.
Right.
This also distorts political campaigns. As we know, the candidates campaign only in, generally they campaign only in competitive states. We sometimes refer to those as battleground states. And they overwhelmingly run advertisements and make appearances in just a handful of states. You can literally count them on one hand. A handful of states get most of the attention.
Right.
And so then your third question is, does this contribute to political polarization?
Yeah.
And I think the answer is absolutely. It contributes to political polarization, because you have presidents elected who do not have the support of the American people, and who a great many people see as illegitimately elected. And so naturally that is going to contribute to polarization in America. And I think that it's fair to say that Donald Trump was a highly polarizing president, not only because of the way he was elected, of course. There are many things about Trump that are polarizing, but certainly the way he that he was elected is one of them.
Right. It certainly agitates people when they hear Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but you got to have Donald Trump as your president, or Al Gore won the popular vote, but here's George W. Bush. And it's somehow, and then you have to get the public to buy that this is still legal, right? We live in a democracy, but the person who won the popular vote isn't going to be the one who gets to be chief. Don't worry, that still means everything works legally. That constantly infuriates and confuses people. And most of our European allies look at our electoral college system and go, what are you guys doing?
Well, there's no other country that elects the chief executive. I don't mean a ceremonial president that some countries have, but the functioning chief executive in such a fashion. So, of course, many countries have prime ministers, and so it's an entirely different system. But those who select presidents don't select them in this fashion, and they certainly don't advocate that the president, the candidate who comes in second, will win the election.
Right, and I found it very interesting, your take, because we are often taught in the media and by other professors and official historians that the founding fathers were geniuses. They basically rediscovered, gold. They figured out this super intelligent document, almost touched by divinity, beyond, looking over what they said. Basically, we're constantly told that the Constitution is a sacred document, and all these people were sacred people, and what they put was the best that could ever be done, and it can't be done any better, and there's no real reason to second guess the Constitution. But it sounds like what you're saying is they knew they had limitations at the time. The founding fathers themselves knew they couldn't figure out everything, and they knew it wasn't the best. Okay.
Yeah, there's no doubt that they knew, that many of them knew that. I mean, there was always some hypercharged rhetoric, but many of the founders, hardly any of the founders thought that the Electoral College, boy, that's a great way to select a president. It was a compromise. It was a compromise created under conditions of exhaustion and a desire to end the Constitutional Convention and not have further conflict, because there was lots of conflict within the Constitutional Convention. I should also add that the very first thing that was done after the Constitution was ratified was to propose the Bill of Rights and the first 10 amendments. So we immediately amended the Constitution. And then we amended again with the 11th and the 12th amendments. So we, right away. Over time, by the way, when it comes down to elections, because our electoral system was not very democratic. And so what did we do? Well, we've had 5 amendments which have guaranteed the right to vote to various groups. Certainly the Civil War Amendment, the 15th Amendment, regarding African Americans, and then we extended it, of course, to women, and we have extended it. We changed the age. We've gotten rid of the poll tax, and in a different way, we have gotten we've gotten Washington. The residents of Washington D.C. now can vote for president, and of course, people now vote for U.S. senators, which they couldn't in the original Constitution. So we may have made many changes regarding voting and elections. And so there's no reason that we couldn't make another amendment regarding the election of the president. So we've changed who can vote, who has a right to vote. We've changed for whom you can vote, meaning we've added U.S. senators. And we can certainly change the way that we elect the president. There's simply no good reason to have the Electoral College.
I'm looking at this Washington Post article, and there's a chart in there called U.S. confidence in government is far below the global average. And it shows confidence in governments, and America's at the bottom compared to our allied countries. Finland, Germany, 80% of the population of Finland has confidence in their governor, 60% has confidence in Germany. You get down to America, it's like 30%. And I'm just wondering if having presidents elected not through the popular vote has an impact on how democratically can we say we are in America when we don't directly elect our top leaders and other countries do.
It is clearly a deviation from democratic principles, and it violates political equality. And it's difficult to parse out just the impact that the Electoral College has on polarization and governmental legitimacy and confidence that people have in government from all the other excuse me, factors that contribute to this. But clearly, it does not help. And of course, confidence in government changes. I mean, it's highly partisan. So when the party of the president switches, the confidence that each party has in government switches. So Republicans had a lot of confidence in government when Donald Trump was president, and virtually the moment that Joe Biden became president, before he really done anything, the confidence switched. In fact, before he became president, confidence switched. So Republicans no longer had confidence in government in general, and Democrats all of a sudden had a lot more confidence. Republicans had been losing confidence in government and certain aspects of government, like the FBI and the Department of Justice, because Donald Trump had been so critical of them. And that remains the case. And also the courts. Donald Trump had been very critical of many courts, and not the Supreme Court uniformly. But again, so you're undermining. So here you've got the leader of a party who's undermining people's confidence in government,
right?
By saying that they're a rogue state and whatever, the deep state, and so you've got the leader of the executive branch criticizing the executive branch. You've got him criticizing individual federal judges, and of course he's criticizing right now. I think we can still say that Donald Trump is the effective leader of the Republican Party. But whether you agree to that or not, and I don't know who the alternative would be, he's certainly criticizing judges and the Department of Justice and the rule of law all the time.
True.
I mean, he does it daily, and one just has to look at his various messages that come out in social media, and they're often quite dramatic rhetoric, dramatic language that he uses to criticize government. So naturally, this doesn't help.
Yeah, I remember that it seemed to be new that when Donald Trump, I think right away when he got in, and he was saying, I don't necessarily trust the intelligence agencies. And then he got into a fight with the FBI early on, and then seemed to have disdain for, the traditional way government was done. So, and I don't recall ever seeing or hearing about that, a president turning on and calling out the FBI is bad, and turning on and calling out the intelligence agencies is bad. That seemed to be new.
It's President Trump has disdain for expertise, or at least when the experts in an area disagree with him. And so he had disdain for the EPA. He had disdain for the intelligence agencies when they told him something different that he wanted to hear. He was critical of medical authorities when they told him things that he didn't want to hear. So that's his modus operandi. He doesn't seem to understand how people can be nonpartisan. So if he just decides that he doesn't believe in climate control and turn it into a religious belief or something, and then he can dismiss all the experts who are providing. I said climate control. Excuse me. I meant climate change.
Yeah. Yeah.
He can dismiss the experts as somehow just foolish or partisan or whatever, even though he himself lacks expertise in the area and doesn't read. Period. He doesn't read memos. He's
Right.
very poorly informed on such matters. But it doesn't really matter. I mean, he just declares them wrong, and even though that they are hired to enforce environmental protection laws, he thinks that all of a sudden this agency, which has been around since the era of Richard Nixon, should overnight stop doing their job. And he doesn't seem to believe in much in the rule of law. And so agencies which have been doing their job defending the rule of law for many decades, many generations actually, well, he finds fault with them as well.
Fair enough. So Trump has been very caustic and aggressive and willing to attack other federal agencies on a scale we've never seen from other presidents, and maybe they've never even tried to do that. The last person I think who called out any institution before Trump was Richard Nixon, and he very slightly, compared to Trump, pushed back on the press. Trump seems to have done it even more. But you seem to have no other presidents recently have tried to do that.
Well, I think there's I'd like to make a distinction here. I mean, there's certainly the press is certainly worth discussing, and I'll be happy to do that. But I was referring to institutions of government.
Right.
And we sometimes refer to the press as the fourth branch.
Right.
And that's an interesting point, and I'll say something about that in a minute. But Richard Nixon certainly wanted to try to take, a more partisan control or a more personal control or more presidential control, however you want to put it, of the executive branch. And but he wasn't anywhere near. He did not exercise or did not display anywhere near the level of criticism and even vitriol about the executive branch that Donald Trump has displayed. Now, the press, many presidents from the beginning of from George Washington actually have been critical of the press, but Donald Trump is the first president who has really tried to undermine the legitimacy of the press and the press role, and declaring it the enemy of the American people. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty clear he's been pretty clear about why he does that, and he does that because he wants to delegitimize him. So when they say things that are critical of him, at least some people won't believe them. Won't believe the press.
Right.
And so we know that Donald Trump has a problem with the truth, I would say. Anyhow, that I would say that he has a problem with the truth. So he lies early and often. And he says many things which simply are not true. And he wants people to ignore the press's criticism of him doing that and offering a counter, an alternative view from his. So delegitimizing a critical institution in democracy does not help. And of course, it doesn't help that we do not have polarization is when people are split, right? I mean, that's what polarization is all about.
Right.
Split within society. And if we don't have some common benchmarks and a sense of a common way of going about figuring things out. If you're critical of the rule of law, if you're critical of scientific findings, and you just want to dismiss those, as the president has, and as I said, in things like environmental protection and healthcare, then you're going to you're reducing the foundations of sensible discourse, and you're undermining the foundations of sensible discourse. And I think that's one of the consequences of what Donald Trump has done. But of course, I have to say that he's not the first. He's not the only one who's contributed to polarization. And so I don't mean to say that he was. And we've had all recent presidents, even when they really weren't acting in a polarizing fashion, have been polarizing figures because of polarization that is already there within the American public. And we don't really know. We know that we can trace some of this way back to Vietnam, given a boost by certainly Watergate. And this is a long time ago.
Right.
And building polarization. And then, I mean, Ronald Reagan was a highly polarizing figure. And all presidents since Ronald Reagan, with the possible exception of maybe Ford and Carter, who weren't wildly popular presidents, needless to say, have been polarizing. The biggest exception to that is George H.W. Bush. But other than that, I mean, Bill Clinton, even though he was not a wildly liberal Democrat, but was a polarizing figure. George W. Bush was a polarizing figure. Of course, Iraq. I mean, once we went to war in Iraq was a highly polarizing war, polarizing public policy. And Barack Obama came in, and from the first day, there was polarization in the views about Barack Obama, despite the fact that I would argue that he did not act in a highly polarizing fashion. And I would act that certainly the war in Iraq was a highly polarizing, unpopular, and unfortunate policy. But other things that, the way George W. Bush tried to govern, I wouldn't say he was an astonishingly polarizing as policymaker. But the war in Iraq, of course, was a very key policy, a central policy in his administration. And it was a highly polarizing policy.
I'd heard that.
But anyhow, I would say, for example, that Joe Biden, whether you particularly like a policy or not, I mean, the policies that he's passed have been often had bipartisan support. So I wouldn't say that he has acted in such a extraordinarily polarizing fashion that the country should respond in a highly divisive fashion, but it has responded in a highly divisive fashion. Nevertheless, with Joe Biden, there's no, and from the first day. So that reflects an underlying polarization. The attitude towards the president, approval of the president, etc., reflect a deep underlying polarization in the American people, and for better or worse, and whether they're right or wrong, and I don't know that we can figure that out in today, but
right.
It's there. It's definitely there, and nobody has a solution. I can imagine a solution that would be great. We'll just have civil discourse. How about that? And let's see what we have in common, and let's try to identify questions in empirical terms. But what we tend to do is be shouting at each other and not really focusing on empirical terms. I'm pretty sure that if you ask people who hate Joe Biden and ask them, well, tell me the policy that you hate. What exactly do you hate about the policies? I think most people would have a very difficult time identifying those policies.
Interesting.
I cannot prove that for obvious reasons. But my reading of public opinion and my reading of public knowledge of public policy is that people would have a very difficult time identifying what they actually hate about Joe Biden. But they have no doubt. I mean, many people hate him. They don't just merely dislike him or would prefer a Republican, for example. They really just have disdain for Joe Biden, and I don't believe that they actually know why. But at any rate,
so you're saying there's a lot of hate for President Biden simply because of the polarized atmosphere, and that if we ask those people
exactly.
they wouldn't.
And yes, so there was hate for Donald Trump before he took office. There was hate for Barack Obama, on day one. And there was efforts to undermine Obama on the Republican side from the opposition to Donald Trump on the Democratic side from day one. Of course, in Donald Trump's case, he began with some highly polarizing. You may recall executive orders regarding travel.
Yeah, and he called Mexicans rapists.
There was a he did give people more, let's say, fodder.
A lot of red meat in the speeches. Very much so.
Exactly.
And,
and that helped him mobilize his base, which is very loyal to him, and that's very impressive in politics. But it also at the same time alienated most people. So Donald Trump never had 50% approval in the Gallup poll, for example.
He was, he was low at approval. However, as I like to point out, before the actual election, there was a point where Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump had the same favorability markings of the American people, and both of them were at the 40-something 2 or 3%. We don't really bring that up anymore, but there was a point where Americans hated both of them equally.
Well, they did. They actually. It's an odd thing. It's an ironic thing because Trump was elected that they actually. They of all the candidates, we have a lot of data, of course, on elections since the 1950s. There's, when we really had polling going strong. And so Hillary Clinton was the second most disliked candidate of any candidates till that time. But the most disliked candidate of any candidate to that time was Donald Trump.
Sure.
But Trump won.
Sure. But we could also go back to George W. Bush. At the time of George W. Bush, I remember going to the protests of the Iraq War. They were talking about how there's never been a president this hated, ever, at that time. And then it got even worse.
I don't know if we could say there's never a president that hated, but he certainly at one point was extremely low. And at the end of his tenure, he was very unpopular. The combination of the Iraq War and the terrible economic turndown. If you recall, the fiscal crisis, we often term it.
Oh, right.
As in the last year, as we were about to go off a cliff, and he sort of handed that off to Barack Obama to deal with.
Right.
Although the Bush administration did take some action at the very end in the final months. It was in a crisis mode. But needless to say, that did not encourage when you have neither peace nor prosperity. That did not encourage support. Of the American public.
I'm just saying that at that time, and especially if you were in California and you were watching liberal news, you had professors and newspaper and politicians and everybody going, "Oh no, most polarizing ever, never could be worse." And then it got way worse with Trump. But I always recall to people, as bad as it was with Trump, they were saying the same thing with Bush. It's never been this polarized. It can't possibly get any worse. He's an unelected president. And then it got worse beyond what anybody ever fathomed to dream.
The differences in views of the president between Republicans and Democrats kept getting worse. Yes.
That's
across presidents. And I think that there's really little end in sight, unfortunately.
That's another question I was going to ask. You already gave the answer. Little end in sight for polarization. Now you're talking about how we could have a constitutional amendment, make the presidential elections democratic. But I was talking to another professor 2 days ago, and he was saying, when's the last time we actually did an amendment? He goes, there was one in the 1990s, but it was really procedural. You got to go back even before that to find something that was substantial, like we're going to give.
Well, it's certainly difficult to amend the Constitution. Of that, there is no doubt. So I don't anticipate that it will happen in the immediate future. But that is what I believe should be done. I do not believe it's an easy thing to do, and I'm not predicting it will be done. And particularly because Republicans feel they have a stake in the way it works. Because if you think about this, and I think people will be surprised to hear this, but it's unequivocally true what I'm about to say. George H.W. Bush was elected in 1988. Okay?
Yeah.
And since that time, since 1988, only one Republican candidate has received a plurality of the vote, and that's George W. Bush in 2004.
Oh, wow.
So the
wow.
Republicans can easily conclude that the only way we're going to elect the president is through the minority route, the electoral college route.
Yeah.
Where a minority of the public can select the president. And so you can, I think that's an unprincipled stance, but one can understand why they might take that stance, because they feel that's the only way that they can get power. And it has now become, unfortunately, and we have a country in which the minority very frequently rules. Now,
thank you.
We're used to thinking about old kind of conspiracies. Well, only the rich rule. The rich always get their way. The poor don't. etc. But I'm talking about something else here.
Right.
And I'm talking about, if we look at the United States Senate, a minority of the public elects a majority of the Senate.
Right.
A small minority of the public can elect a majority of the Senate. And so I believe that Washington Post article pointed out that recent Supreme Court nominees, many of them, have been confirmed by senators representing a minority of the public.
Yep.
So the Senate is not a democratic institution. That's a small d, by the way.
Right.
If the presidency is frequently not a democratic institution, because the candidate supported by most Americans doesn't always win.
Right.
And if you have gerrymandering, which allows the House, many House seats to be how do I say this? A minority of the public can elect the majority of the House. So that combination is one that can really alienate a lot of people. They don't understand, what they think, and they get a majority of the vote on behalf of some idea or some candidate, some party, and still that's not enough.
Right.
It's not enough to enact the policies that a majority supports. And so that's frustrating. And of course, there's gerrymandering on the state level as well. One can think of North Carolina, one can think of Wisconsin, and so a minority of the votes can elect a majority of the state legislature and enact policies that the majority doesn't want, or stop policies from being enacted that a majority does want.
Right.
And that is very frustrating and irritating to many people, and one can easily understand it.
I'd like to read a quote.
Today,
If I could, real quick, I'd like to read a quote to you, and
okay.
get your opinion. So this was from Norman Ornstein, a
Yeah.
well-known demographer. Yeah, and he was talking to a man called Paul Waldman. I think he also does policy. So Paul Waldman made this comment, and then Ornstein replied to it. So Paul Waldman said this: in the age of minority rule, a Supreme Court justice appointed by a president who got fewer votes is confirmed by a party in the Senate that got fewer votes to validate policies opposed by most Americans. And Ornstein responded to that by saying, I want to repeat a statistic I use in every talk. By 2040 or so, 70% of Americans will live in 15 states, meaning 30% of America that only lives in the other states will choose 70 senators, and the 30% will be older, whiter, more rural, and more male than the 70%. They were talking about the rule of the minority because the Senate, the Electoral College, the ability to shut everything down, choose Supreme Court justices, choose the presidency, etc. And the thing I try to educate the public about is all that is baked into the Constitution. It's not just an interpretation. Like, that is hardcore baked into the Constitution for states to have that kind of power.
That is correct. That is correct. I mean, the founders, we know, did not anticipate the great differences in populations among the states.
Right.
So at the time that the Constitution was written, I think that the greatest disparity was about 8-1.
Right.
Okay, 1 state 8. But now California, for example, the greatest disparity is between California and Wyoming.
Right.
Where California has approximately 68 times as many people as Wyoming.
Right.
But they have the same say in the United States Senate.
Right.
And that, of course, is very disturbing. I mean, it's no one. If we didn't have a constitution, and someone looked across the country and they saw the land and they saw the people and the distribution of the people, etc. I can't imagine that anyone would say, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll give Wyoming and California the same amount of power in the Senate." I mean, who would do that? That's crazy.
Right.
Nobody would do that, and it's unjustifiable. You cannot justify that. It is the rule. And Norm Ornstein, who's an old friend of mine, is absolutely right. That is the way it works, and it would be much worse if all the small states were one party or the other. The Republicans have an advantage among the small states, but not every small state is Republican.
Sure.
It would be much worse if that were the case, and not every big state is Democratic.
Right.
Florida and Texas being, the second and third largest states. Texas being the second in population, and Florida being the third.
Right.
Are not Democratic states. So it's not all one-sided, which is helpful to American democracy. But it is the case that the Senate, an effective majority in the Senate, and it's often the case, they represent a relatively modest percentage of the American public. And of course, they are confirming Supreme Court justices. And it is the case that Donald Trump, who the American public did not want, they wanted another candidate, they wanted Hillary Clinton, could nominate justices who were confirmed by senators representing a minority of the population. So a president representing a minority of the population nominates justices who are confirmed by senators representing a minority of the population.
Yep.
It happens that these days, that is, the minority is the Republicans, and so it's the Democrats who are frustrated, and Republican officials don't care, are content to get as much as they can. There have been times, of course, when Democrats have had extraordinary gerrymandering on their behalf. There never has been a Democratic president elected with a minority without getting the most votes, without winning at least a plurality of the vote. That never has happened.
Right.
It's always been Republicans who benefited.
Huh.
But at any rate, well, I actually want to take that back. This is a technical issue, but I think one could argue that JFK did not receive. He received the majority of the electoral votes. That was easy. But I think one could make an argument he did not receive a majority, a plurality of the vote, of the popular vote. I think Richard Nixon actually won the popular vote. But that's a highly technical matter that would take quite a while to discuss. And but anyhow, I have made that case.
I've also heard of irregularities with the Kennedy election and connections.
Well, I wasn't even talking about that.
Oh, okay.
I think that even if you looked at that, Kennedy still would. I mean, there was a lot of checking in the votes in Illinois, for example, and
Chicago.
But they still he still seemed to have gotten the most votes. I was referring to Alabama. In Alabama, the electors, there were 11 electors, and 6 of those electors, they actually had an election for electors. They had a primary for electors, which is, people
That's
can't
weird.
even conceive of, but they did. And 6 of the electors were anti-Kennedy, and they ran against Kennedy electors. And 6 of the electors, you have to remember, this is 1960 now, civil rights and all that is at the forefront of American politics. So six anti-Kennedy electors were elected, and they didn't vote for Kennedy when it came time to cast their electoral votes. Okay, so they had made it pretty clear: we ran against Kennedy electors, and we're not for Kennedy, and we're not going to vote for Kennedy.
Okay.
Nevertheless, we've given all of the votes cast in Alabama for Democratic electors to Kennedy, and it seems that is not necessarily a sensible thing to do. And we ought to give 5/11ths of the elector of the vote to Kennedy. If you do that, then Nixon got the most votes.
Wow.
Across the country.
Wow.
But at any rate, it's highly technical.
Okay.
Difficult for people to
yeah.
think about
okay.
this.
Well, maybe another show. I do want to get back to this point where you're saying people like Trump and others who are critical of the law and scientific findings, you're part of the problem. So we had people doubt it, but Trump really, like we were talking about, really called doubt into question on other federal agencies. And I think talking with you, no other president had really done that. I mean, sure, they were upset with other agencies in the past, but calling them out and telling the American people to not have faith in them, that was new and bold and very Trumpian and not good and causes polarization. But I want to ask you about, was it only him? I remember when James Comey was the director of the FBI and Hillary Clinton was running against Trump, the election hadn't happened yet. And Comey went on TV and talked about Hillary Clinton's servers. And liberals turned on the FBI and Comey immediately and called them out into question as being politicized, and they must hate Hillary Clinton, and that's why they did that. Now, we don't talk about that a lot because Trump then really laid in on the FBI and the game turned. But right after James Comey called out Hillary Clinton on TV, there was a lot of hate from liberals directed at the FBI and Comey and questioning if they were legitimate.
Absolutely. What I think that
that's not good, right?
I think, first of all, it's appropriate for any president, that includes Trump, to disagree with some decision that was made. In the case of Comey, and he may have cost Hillary Clinton the election because I believe it was October 28th, just a few days before the election. He said, "I'm reopening the investigation of Hillary Clinton because we found a new laptop, and
Right.
And normally that was against routine procedure,
Okay.
and it was a violation of the procedure, and he had a justification for that. I never was convinced justification, but at any rate, so that's what they were angry about.
Right.
And I would think that Democrat or Republican, it would be perfectly appropriate to say that was a bad decision.
Okay.
But that's different than going after the entire department.
But they
saying,
called into
right,
but they called into question the FBI's intelligence because he was the director or the top FBI. They called into question their intelligence, and they also called into question if they were biased against Clinton. I mean, that's telling the people this agency might be politically biased against Hillary Clinton, and that's why they did that. They were not saying,
right.
"Oh, it's a technical ruling and it's tough, but we understanding." Liberals were jumping on TV saying this agency must hate Clinton. That can't be good for establishing trust.
The agency hated Clinton, or I don't recall them attacking the agency. I recall them, of course, criticizing the decision of a particular person and saying, who of course was in the agency, but saying that was a bad judgment. And of course, people have been criticizing cabinet members forever, and other high-level officials. The FBI is within the Department of Justice, but they have been criticizing the actions. Democrats and Republicans do that all the time, and that's perfectly fine. I mean, that's how we hold people accountable. I mean, certainly people were, let's just say, Donald Rumsfeld. There was lots of criticism of Donald Rumsfeld during the war in Iraq, right? And there are criticism of cabinet officials routinely. Right now, Republicans are criticizing the action of the Department of Homeland Security, of the leader of the Department of Homeland Security, because of immigration, or what they view as failure to enforce.
Right, Mayorkas. Yeah.
Appropriate. That's perfectly fine. That's what should happen. We should have criticism of department officials if people think that they're not doing their job properly. I think there's a line somewhere when you're undermining, you're trying to undermine an entire agency, because when the Republicans are criticizing the cabinet member leading the Department of Homeland Security, they're not saying that all the people in the Department of Homeland Security are not doing a good job, because they actually, and they don't actually even mean that. They mean that the policy is bad. And that is fine. Whether they may be right, they may be wrong, and we can discuss that forever, I suppose. But I think that's a different thing than trying to undermine the ability of a department to carry out the law.
Okay.
And that's what I think where Donald Trump crossed the line with the Department of Justice, with other departments as well. The EPA is another example. I think he crossed the line and tried to undermine the ability of the departments to do the job that the law says they should do, and that what they were hired to do. And I think that's different. And when you're talking, and then when you get to a fundamental matter like the rule of law, and you're undermining the ability of government to protect the rule of law and to function according to the rule of law, then I think you got a much bigger problem for democracy. So that's what I'm particularly worried about, and that's why I would draw a distinction.
I'll just leave it at Slate magazine, which is a super mega liberal magazine, has an article saying liberal attacks on Jim Comey are surprisingly similar to the conservative ones. So they're directly tying these two together. But I don't want to get bogged down. Let me ask you about another thing. What about when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, and you had politicians in the Democratic Party saying, we defy the Supreme Court and we will not listen to their rulings? That can't build trust in institutions too, right? No,
and that is frankly, those words that you just quoted to me are essentially meaningless. I mean, what does it mean to defy the Supreme Court, or we won't follow? I mean, of course they're going to follow. They got no choice. I mean, you can have further litigation, but what does that actually mean? I mean,
it's a fair
really?
point. It's a fair point, but I'm just saying you have an elected official saying, I'm not going to follow the rules and I don't care what this federal agency says. That can't be good for.
No, that is certainly not good.
Okay, that's all I'm asking.
I think it's perfectly fine to criticize a ruling, and it's perfect on both sides, and it's perfectly fine to say, look, here's what the law or the Constitution really holds, and we have a different view. And of course, that's what discourse and political discourse is all about. It's to offer different views and make different arguments, and that's what you do, and that's what you should do in democracy. But ultimately, the rule of law depends on people following the rule of law and complying with the law. The Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of the law. So until you can get the Supreme Court to change its mind, that's the law, and I think we have to comply with it whether we like it or not.
Oh, I agree. I'm just talking about how, yes, Trump was an elected official of a high level saying maybe we don't need to trust these federal agencies, and that was bad. And he certainly did that to a level beyond everybody else. I just wanted to point out he wasn't alone. There were times where not Trump, liberals said things. I was in California. Our lieutenant governor said, we defy the Supreme Court. Like, their rulings don't mean anything to us. That's basically telling people to ignore federal law. And it's damn close to what the South Carolina was saying in 1865.
I wish people wouldn't say things like that.
No one contradicted her, and everyone backed her up.
To your argument. However, it had no meaning. I mean, California, abortion didn't change a bit.
Sure.
Didn't change anything. The Supreme Court decision was just irrelevant to California because the Supreme Court was simply saying you have no right to an abortion. You have no constitutional right to an abortion. However, states can give that right because there's more than the Constitution that gives rights, and California has it. It's in no danger, so there's no defying. So it's just sort of empty rhetoric that you're quoting to me.
Sure.
It's empty rhetoric. It has no meaning.
Okay.
Because there's nothing to defy. There's nothing to defy in California. What would you defy? I mean, you still got exactly the same access to abortion that you had before the Supreme Court made that decision.
Yeah, I'm just talking about it's not good when highly elected officials say anything that resembles language suggesting we don't need to follow a federal agency and listen to them over their arena of authority. That's all I'm saying.
I agree. I wish that the lieutenant governor had used different language and saying, I disagree. And in California, we're going to continue the same policy that we have. And I hope other states would follow our lead. And many states have. Many states have.
True. Yeah.
And I think it raises this very matter of abortion raises an interesting point, and that is that when states have had the opportunity, when the people of states have had the opportunity to vote on abortion, they have tended to vote to support that right, and which is very interesting. And one of the things that pro-abortion partisans and anti-abortion, have tried to do, and we saw this most recently in Ohio, is not give people the option of voting, or to make it. In Ohio, they wanted to raise the threshold,
right,
of changing the Constitution,
right,
and people voted against it. So, so democracy in action. Initiative, referenda, etc. It's a complicated matter,
right?
And you can't govern all the time that way. But on really big, high-profile issues that are highly salient to the public, it seems to me a reasonable thing to do. And when given the opportunity, people have chosen to support abortion rights.
Generally, not every state,
not
but
every
generally,
state may make that decision, but it is interesting, and it seems to me quite reasonable for people to have that right. We've also seen that, by the way, with expanding Medicaid, when lots of states, number of states, chose not to expand Medicaid.
Right.
Obamacare.
Right.
Obamacare.
Right.
And one of the aspects of Obamacare is support money to the states to expand Medicaid, to expand health care to more people. And a number of, we'll call them red states, chose not to do that.
Right.
And when given the opportunity to vote on this, the public, when they were able to vote on this, they have chosen, I think every single time, to expand Medicaid.
Right. And then we can get into the larger argument of why does the public want certain things and they don't seem to get them out of government. There was the Princeton study from 2014 that showed what the public wants, they typically don't get, going back to the 1970s. I don't want to get too far into it, but yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I want to come back to, you don't anticipate an amendment to the Constitution, and you don't have, it seems like, a lot of faith that things are going to get better. What would you tell someone who's concerned about political polarization in America? What would you tell them, like, to do or to think or to hope for to make it better?
Well, I think the only thing that I have, I don't know, there's no silver bullet to just
Sure.
end polarization, but I think that you can have sensible discourse by trying to turn questions into empirical ones. So instead of saying, having highly heated rhetoric, we were just talking about healthcare, so let's take that, and everyone is concerned about healthcare because we all have health. Instead of just blasting away one side or another for, on the one hand, God, it must be communist or socialist or something like that. Also,
right.
Medicare, wildly popular policy, is certainly government healthcare policy. But at any rate, and the other side say, well, you just don't care about people at all,
right?
And you're just a bunch of you respond to wealthy people who don't want to pay taxes, et cetera, and you're no good.
Right.
Well, I think that we could have a sensible policy and say, okay, what will this cost? Who are the people who are going to benefit? What is the best way, for them to get access to health care? Do they deserve to have health care? Let's discuss that once we know who they are. For example, are they single working moms? Is that the people we're going to, because there's probably a lot of sympathy for that.
Right.
And et cetera. So I think I think that you can indeed start talking about issues in a sensible fashion and then have a discussion about these questions, as specific questions. Well, let's decompose this.
Right.
And into questions so we can discuss, as opposed to have, just ideological questions or knee-jerk reactions to the other party. And that's largely what it is. I mean, there was knee-jerk reactions to Obamacare because Obama's a Democratic president, and so, by God, we're Republican states, so we're not going to, give our people. So I live in Texas. In Texas, of all, if you take all the developed world, the developed democracies across the world, and you look at the major political units, okay, Texas being a major political unit, Texas has more people who don't have access to health care than any other place in the world.
Really?
So,
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It would be in the developed world now. Okay.
Yeah.
So
That's a fact. That happens to be a fact.
Right.
So why don't we discuss this? Why can't we have a sensible discussion about this and let's put away the labels and the rhetoric and the heat, and discuss who doesn't have health care in Texas. How much would it cost, Texas taxpayers to do something about it? Do they deserve it? Is there any more efficient way? Can we think of a better way to do that? That's fine, because everybody wants a more efficient way to accomplish goals. I mean, nobody's saying, well, let's do it the inefficient way. So I think that, it is possible to do that, and we can have a sensible discussion. We can have a sensible discussion about lots of things,
Right.
But immigration,
Hey,
we're do we need workers in America? Well,
I think so.
I think an argument can be made. Yeah, we need a lot of workers, and if you're going to grow your economy, you kind of have people working. At any rate,
you would think.
Yeah, you could have a discussion about this, but you don't need 20 million workers coming in a year. I just made that up. It's
Sure.
but so somewhere you can have a sensible discussion. It is possible. So anyhow, that would be my idea.
And I will just say George W. Bush was really good at reaching out to the Latino voters. I mean, he was really good despite all of his other faults. I have to bring up, my family's from a town near Amarillo. I guess you call it Amarilla. It's called Dumas, Texas.
I don't know. I'm from New York, so I don't have.
Oh, okay. Never mind. I thought, okay, I had to bring it up because my family's like, we're apart from Texas. Okay. Last two questions. You're not you. You're not me. You're a third-party person who's watching this video. And they said, wow, I learned a lot. I've heard some things I didn't hear other people say, like looking at the founding fathers, and they didn't have all the answers and they knew it. But they're watching the whole video and they're going over it, and they struggle to remember everything, but they keep telling themselves there was this one thing that the professor said, and it's 5 days after I finished watching that video, and I still can't get this professor's thought out of my head. What is that one thought you want someone to not be able to get out of their head 5 days after watching this interview?
Well, I'm not sure I have one. I'd like to remember
2 or 3 thoughts. No more than 3. No more than 3.
Okay, the Electoral College is not good for America. That's number one. And the other one is what we were just talking about, which is that I think that you can decompress politics by decomposing the issues and having sensible discourse about specific components of a policy. And it's not necessary to demonize your opponents. They're your opponents, not your enemies. And that's quite different. So that's what I'd like people to remember.
Okay. I hope you found this was a fair interview. We didn't do any gotcha journalism. You don't have to, but we always ask, do you know anybody else who might be willing to be part of a conversation on political polarization? Any recommendations? You don't have to, but we always ask, always try to keep the conversation going.
Well, I looked at your list, and so you've had a lot of the people that I would recommend. I don't know if you had Gary Jacobson, who's a emeritus professor from the University of California in San Diego.
No, I have not.
Well, I think he's a very able person, and I would think he'd be a good person to consider.
Definitely, I will definitely reach out to him, and I really appreciate that. And if you ever get the chance to talk to Norman Ornstein, if you could maybe put a bird in his ear, so I would love to interview him one day. I know he's a difficult man to get a hold of, but it's a dream of mine.
Yeah, Norman's a good guy, and his friend Tom Mann,
right,
is also very, very good. Any rate, let me ask you a question, if I might.
Sure.
Is this a podcast? I mean, what do you do with all this?
I just posted to my personal YouTube channel. So basically, the story I always tell everybody who asks, I think it's the first time it's on video, but I always tell like 30 of the interviewees. This is the story. Marjorie Taylor Greene, I'm not endorsing her, came out with her tweet on President's Day, red and blue can't live together. And I thought, okay, well, that's an interesting statement. So I wanted to see what coverage was being done. I found one NPR article where they interviewed 3 professors, all from an elite coastal university, or like 2 different elite coastal universities. And they basically concluded, well, polarization is because of social media and it makes all the conservatives angry and it's mostly a Republican problem. Okay, moving on. And I thought, right, I thought that's so shallow for, you're talking about the potential of ripping apart America. And the best analysis we got was 3 professors who basically spent 5 minutes on it. And I thought that's not good enough. So I said, I'm going to use my contacts I had from activism, and I'm just going to start interviewing as many professors as I could possibly get. And what happened was, after the 10th one, they started giving me recommendations, and everybody was saying, nobody's doing this. Nobody. I go, okay, well, then I'll just keep doing it, posting it to my personal YouTube channel. And a lot of professors are watching the video because every time I invite someone, I put the list of other videos there so they get to see other professors. And it kind of grows. It's a project of love. We don't have a big viewer count. We don't have an advertising budget, but I still find we're kind of the only group out there trying to take what a lot of professors and experts know to be true and explaining it in a manner that the public can easily digest. So they don't have to read, they don't have to go look it up. It's sit here and listen, because the public likes podcasts. So I stole the Nisenan Center, I think, does a little bit of this, but that's about it. And it's a labor of love. I just want to get the information out there, and no one's doing this, basically.
Well, I'm glad you are, and I congratulate you for it, and I wish you the best.
Thank you. I appreciate that. We'll end it there. I will email you a copy of the interview shortly, and I want to say thank you for coming out, Professor. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Take care.
Okay. Take care, sir.
Bye.
That concludes our interview, and we'll see you soon.